All right, this is Memory Section B lecture, our prioritized standard 6A. Objectively, we're going to analyze the process by which memories are retrieved. As for how memories are retrieved, has to do with if the memories are implicit memories, which is a memory that has not deliberately been learned or of which you have no conscious awareness, or if it's an explicit memories. Explicit memories, this means a memory that has been processed with attention and can be consciously recalled. A memory is implicit if it can affect behavior or mental processes without becoming fully conscious. Yet an explicit memory always involves consciousness during retrieval. Procedural memories are often implicit memories, so as the person performing an action likely remembers the specifics of movement without actively thinking about how their body will need to actually move. As where semantic memories are can be either explicit or implicit. So as remembering a fact might involve consciously thinking about the answer, so that act would be an explicit one. But being a native English speaker, you will likely not consciously be thinking about what language to speak your answer in, which would therefore make that implicit. Now, for accurate retrieval of memories from long-term memory, both implicit and explicit memories require the use of retrieval cues. So retrieval cues are stimuli that are used to bring a memory to consciousness or into behavior. Things like a certain odor or an emotion might easily serve as a retrieval cue, where a long dormant experience might be quickly brought back into your active consciousness. So potentially maybe a smell might remind you of being at your grandparents' house when you were a child, or possibly a certain memory might remind you of another time when you had a similar type of emotion. But some memories are not so easily cued. So for instance, like blanking on a test, if a question's asked in a different way than you had probably studied that, then certain cues aren't going to retrieve it as easily. Now, priming is a technique for cueing implicit memories by providing cues that stimulate a memory without awareness of the connection between the cue and the retrieved memory. So priming works by activating an association or representation in memory just before another stimulus or task is introduced. So priming works most effectively when the two stimuli are the same sensory type. So for instance, visual priming works best with visual cues, as where verbal priming works best with verbal cues. So priming is a technique used by psychologists in studying non-conscious processes. So in this example of priming, number 5, if you notice, is the same if it is in the white column or the black column, but depending on the priming cues, it's going to probably elicit a different answer. So in the white one, a red, blue, orange, yellow, green, as where in the second column, you're going to see plum, nectarine, pear, apple, so you'd likely say grape. So again, that has primed what your response is going to be. As anything stored in long-term memory must be filed according to its pattern or meaning, the best way to add material to long-term memory for easily retrieving would be through a process known as elaborative rehearsal, which this shows where that would probably take place. And by elaborative rehearsal, this is a method in which information you hope to add to long-term memory is actively reviewed and related to information already in long-term memory. All right, so an example of elaborative rehearsal. So maybe you're trying to remember which one's Vermont, which one's New Hampshire. So possibly to relate that to something you already know is going to make this an easier process. So potentially if you try to remember that, well, Vermont starts with a V, and this particular Vermont does kind of have this V shape. So hopefully that makes it easier to remember because you already remember what a V is. And then if you're thinking of New Hampshire, you can think, well, New Hampshire looks kind of like a lowercase n. So possibly that cue, that type of elaborative rehearsal could possibly make it easier to look at these two and know that, oh, that's Vermont, and this one has to be New Hampshire. Elaborative rehearsal helps your brain more effectively encode information into your long-term memory by requiring the brain to process it in a more in-depth way. With elaborative rehearsal, at the time that new information enters the working memory, one must actively try to associate or relate it to information that is already in long-term memory. So making meaningful organizations through thinking of personal examples of concepts will usually make those more easily retrieved when you try to find those later. Retrieval of explicit memories can be cued in two main ways: recall and recognition. So recall, this is a retrieval method in which one must reproduce previously presented information. So like when on an essay test, or if you have to write an essay, this is where you're expected to create an answer almost entirely from memory, with the help of potentially only minimal cues that come from the question. As where recognition is a retrieval method in which one must identify present stimuli as having been previously presented. So this would be more like on a multiple choice test, where you have to try to identify which option correctly correlates with what you have previously learned. Now, normally recognition is going to be less demanding than recall, because the cues available for a recognition task are going to be much more complete. So this is the reason why you might hear people sometimes say, I'm terrible with names, but I never forget a face. Because the recall, meaning knowing a specific name, is going to be a much tougher task than the recognition, which is just identifying a face as being one that you are familiar with. Now, additionally, the ability to effectively retrieve information from long-term memory depends on whether the information was encoded and elaborated in a meaningful fashion, or a way to make it meaningful. Now, the encoding specificity principle is the doctrine that says memory is encoded and stored with specific cues related to the content that was formed. So the more closely the retrieval cues match the form in which the information was encoded, the better it can be remembered. So for instance, they've done some research that actually has shown that students actually do better on standardized tests like the ACT or like your TCAT exams when they take it in a classroom setting where they initially learn the information. So classrooms usually are better than benches. Also, being at a desk usually is correlated with better scores than like being in the cafeteria, like seating area where you would have lunch. So generally that's why when you take state standardized tests, you almost always are going to take it in a desk setting and not at a table setting. Now, if retrieval cues do not actually match the form in which the information was encoded, you have a more difficult time remembering it. So for instance, you've learned all day at school, but when you're asked what you learned today outside of school, you might actually have a more difficult time remembering what you learned because you aren't in the setting where you were learning in the first place. This may be why when you can't find something or you forgot what you were looking for, it can actually be helpful to go back to the last location you were in when you last saw it or before you started to look for the item in the first place. Now, your emotions and mood at the time of learning information can actually influence your ability to retrieve memories in a phenomenon known as mood congruent memory. So with mood congruent memory, this indicates that when individuals store memories, they not only store the event, but they also store a memory of the mood they were in at the time. So this is why when people feel happy, they often recall other memories of times when they were happy. Or when they're depressed, they're going to be more easily remembering other unhappy events they might have had. Now, strong emotional associations allow some types of memories to have virtually automatic encoding, which is the tendency of certain kinds of information to enter long-term memory with either little or no effortful encoding. So like with what are called flashbulb memories. Now, flashbulb memories are clear and vivid long-term memories of an especially meaningful and emotional event. So typically these memories record precisely where the individual was at the time they received the news, what they were doing, and the emotions that they felt. So if you know someone that remembers 9/11 and ask them, hey, where were you on 9/11? They will be able to tell you a very detailed story of probably what happened. However, some flashbulb memories actually become distorted over time. So, meaning the same person may actually give very different account of the same event over the course of several years. But the person actually reporting will actually have a very high confidence level of their recollection. So, an example that kind of proves this is many people that lived through the JFK assassination, they mistakenly believe that they saw the assassination occur live on television. Because based on the film, you've probably seen that many times throughout your life, especially people that lived through it. But this was actually not a televised event. So that type of memory is not technically a correct memory because it wasn't televised. Also, alertness, stress level, drugs, and general knowledge also affect retrieval of memories. All right, that concludes Memory Section B lecture. Our prioritized standard again was 6A. And objectively, now you can analyze the process by which memories are retrieved.